Imagine a world rotting from the inside, where the laughter of cruel men echoes in blood-soaked streets and fallen titans stalk the land, where every thought of the human heart is poison and the Creator's grief hangs thick in the air. This is the world drowning in darkness. But in the shadows stands one man, a shipbuilder on dry land, a preacher of doom, a last flicker of light. His name was Noah, and the storm gathering on the horizon would change everything. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become, and his heart was deeply troubled. Genesis 6 verses 5 to 6. The air in those days before the flood hung thick, not just with humidity, but with the stench of corruption. It was supposed to be a golden age. Descendants of the mighty heroes of old, the Nephilim, strode the earth. But power, unchecked, curdled. Violence wasn't just common, it was the currency. Greed festered, cruelty was celebrated, and the sacred spark within humanity, the divine image, was smothered beneath layers of filth and selfishness. God looked upon the earth and his heart broke, not with petty anger, but with a profound, cosmic grief. Genesis 6 verses 5 to 6. Creation groaned under the weight of its own perversion. Yet, in this suffocating darkness, one man stood apart, not because he was physically mightier or wealthier, but because he walked a different path. Noah. The scriptures call him a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time. Genesis 6 verse 9. Imagine him. Perhaps calloused hands from honest labor, eyes that still held a spark of kindness amidst the surrounding cynicism, ears that strained to hear the still, small voice others had long drowned out. He found favor in the eyes of the grieving Creator. One day, the voice came, clear and heavy with sorrow. Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me. The earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. The pronouncement must have struck Noah like a physical blow. Destroy everything? But the voice continued, outlining a plan so audacious it defied belief. Make yourself an ark. Genesis 6 verses 13 to 14. The specifications were staggering. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Picture it, longer than a football field, a colossal floating box made of resilient gopher wood, sealed inside and out with sticky, pungent pitch. 3 decks, compartments galore. A vessel not for conquest, but for salvation through utter devastation. God spoke of a covenant, a sacred agreement he would establish with Noah. Salvation hinged on this man's obedience. Noah didn't hesitate. He believed God. Hebrews 11 verse 7. The monumental task began. Imagine the scene. Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, felling massive, ancient trees. The rhythmic thwack of axes, the groan of timber, the scrape of adzes shaping wood, the smell of fresh sawdust mingling with the acrid tang of boiling pitch, and the laughter. Oh, the derision. For 120 years, Genesis 6 verse 3, they labored. Neighbors mocked. Noah's folly, they jeered. Building a boat on dry land? Has the sun baked his brain? Merchants scoffed at the wasted resources. Warriors sneered at the peaceful endeavor. Noah preached righteousness, warning of the coming judgment, 2 Peter 2 verse 5, but his words fell on deaf, scornful ears. Only his family stood with him, his faithful wife, his sons, and their wives. 8 souls against a world hurtling towards oblivion. Finally, the colossal structure stood complete, a behemoth of timber, a silent, looming accusation against the surrounding wickedness. Then came the command, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. For in 7 days I will send rain." Genesis 7 verses 1 and 4. The countdown began. Gathering the animals was a miracle in itself. Picture Noah standing at the massive ramp as creatures approached, driven by an unseen divine instinct. Not chaotic stampedes, but orderly processions. Majestic lions padding silently beside skittish deer. Towering giraffes folding impossibly to enter. Elephants, their wise eyes seeming to understand the gravity. Fluttering clouds of birds, eagles, sparrows, ravens, doves, finding their perches. Creeping insects, slithering reptiles, burrowing rodents. The air filled with a cacophony of roars, trumpets, chirps, and bellows. They came in sevens of the clean animals for future sacrifice and food, and twos of the unclean, Genesis 7 verses 2 to 3. The logistics defy imagination. Feeding, watering, managing waste for months in a confined space. The ark became a living, breathing, roaring, chirping microcosm of God's creation. On the seventh day, the sky changed. An unnatural stillness descended. The mocking crowds fell silent, perhaps feeling the first prickle of unease. Then a low rumble, not from the sky, but from the deep. The fountains of the great deep burst forth. Genesis 7 verse 11. Imagine geysers, colossal and terrifying, erupting from the ocean floor, spewing water skyward. The very foundations of the earth shuddered. Then the heavens tore open. Not gentle rain, but a deluge, a catastrophic downpour, as if the celestial reservoirs had been emptied. The windows of the heavens were opened. Water roared from above and surged from below. The massive ark, once an object of ridicule, lifted. It groaned and creaked as the waters surged, lifting it free from the land that had mocked it. The door, that immense pitch-sealed door, was shut by the Lord himself, Genesis 7 verse 16. A final irrevocable act. Safety was inside. Judgment raged outside. For 40 days and 40 nights, the relentless torrent fell, Genesis 7 verse 12. The waters rose, swallowing hills, then mountains. The highest peaks vanished beneath the churning, debris-filled ocean. The sounds from outside changed. The roar of rain and geysers, then the terrifying crash of collapsing structures, the distant, desperate cries of the drowning, finally fading into a dreadful, watery silence. All life, not sheltered in the ark, perished. Every laugh, every cruel word, every act of violence, silenced beneath the weight of the judgment waters. Only the groaning timbers of the ark, the restless sounds of the animals within, and the prayers of 8 souls remained. The flood prevailed on the earth for 150 days, Genesis 7 verse 24. Imagine the confinement, the damp darkness, the constant labor to care for the animals, the psychological weight of knowing the entire world was gone. The grief, even for the wicked, the fear, the smell of animals, pitch, damp wood, and close quarters. Months turned into an eternity adrift on a featureless sea. Then, God remembered Noah, Genesis 8 verse 1. Not that he forgot, but he turned his active attention toward salvation. He sent a wind to blow over the earth. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the waters began to recede. The fountains of the deep closed, the windows of heaven shut. The rain stopped, the colossal ark settled, not on a mountain peak, but on the mountains of Ararat, Genesis 8 verse 4. Jagged peaks emerged like islands in a vast muddy ocean. They waited and waited. 40 more days passed. Hope flickered, fragile. Noah needed confirmation. He opened a window. Imagine that first breath of fresh, rain-washed air after a year inside. He sent out a raven. The strong, black bird flew back and forth, finding perches on floating debris, but never returning to the ark. It could survive in the wet world. Next, a dove. It fluttered out, but found no resting place. The earth was still submerged. It returned to Noah's waiting hand, a symbol of their continued isolation. 7 days later, he sent the dove again. This time, it returned in the evening, and in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Genesis 8, verse 11. A tiny green miracle. Life was returning. The waters had receded enough for trees to bud. Hope, tangible and green, rested in Noah's palm. 1 week later, the dove flew out and never returned. It had found a home. The earth was drying. God spoke, "Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing." Genesis 8 verses 15 to 17. Imagine the scene. The massive door, sealed by God a year before, was opened. Sunlight, blindingly bright after the gloom, streamed in. The smell of wet earth, not decay, filled their nostrils. They stepped out onto new ground. The animals poured forth. A joyous, chaotic exodus of every kind, reclaiming the cleansed earth. The silence was gone, replaced by the sounds of life reborn. Noah's first act was worship. He built an altar from stones, untouched by the corruption of the old world. He took some of the clean animals and birds he had preserved and offered burnt offerings, Genesis 8 verse 20. The smoke, a sweet savor, rose towards heaven. It wasn't just sacrifice, it was profound gratitude, acknowledging God's salvation and judgment. God smelled the pleasing aroma and made a promise. Never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. Genesis 8, verse 21. He accepted the reality of human sinfulness, but chose mercy anchored in covenant. The Rainbow Covenant, Genesis 9. God established a new order, a covenant not just with Noah, but with every living creature on earth, a covenant marked by a breathtaking sign, blessing and commission. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Life was to begin anew. Sustenance. Animals were now given for food, but with a sacred boundary. No consuming blood, the symbol of life, Genesis 9 verse 4, sanctity of life. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. Genesis 9 verse 6. Human life was declared inviolably sacred. The sign, I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Genesis 9 verses 13 and 15. The very instrument of destruction, storm clouds, would now bear the sign of promise. The bow pointed away from the earth, a divine weapon laid aside. Noah, the righteous survivor, became a farmer. He planted a vineyard. One day, weakened perhaps by the immense trauma he'd endured, or simply the effects of the fermented wine he wasn't accustomed to, he became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent, Genesis 9 verse 21. The hero stumbled. Ham, his youngest son, saw his father's nakedness. Instead of covering him respectfully, preserving his dignity, Ham mocked him, telling his brothers outside. Shem and Japheth, displaying the righteousness of their father, took a garment, walked backward into the tent, refusing to look, and covered Noah. When Noah awoke and learned what Ham, specifically Ham's son Canaan in the prophecy, had done, he pronounced blessings on Shem and Japheth, but a curse on Canaan, son of Ham, Genesis 9 verses 25 to 27. This foreshadowed future conflicts and the establishment of lineages. Noah lived 350 years after the flood. He witnessed the earth repopulate. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the fathers of nations spreading across the renewed earth, Genesis 10, the Table of Nations. From Shem would eventually come Abraham, and through him, the line of promise. Ham's descendants settled Africa, parts of Arabia, and Canaan. Japheth spread into Europe and Asia Minor. The world began anew, diverse and vast, carrying the memory of the flood and the promise of the rainbow. The legacy. The story of Noah is more than an ancient tale of survival. It's a profound narrative about the gravity of sin. Its corruption reaches God's heart and has devastating consequences. The need for righteousness. God seeks and saves those who walk with him, even in a corrupt world. Divine judgment and mercy. God is just, but his heart breaks over judgment. The flood reveals his holiness. The rainbow reveals his steadfast love and promise. Covenant faithfulness. God binds himself to his creation with an unbreakable promise. A new beginning. Cleansing allows for renewal, but human frailty remains. Hope persists through God's covenant, not human perfection. The weight of water and the light of promise. The flood was terrifying, but the rainbow endures. Every storm cloud holds the potential for that luminous arc, reminder etched across the sky. God remembers. God promises. God saves. The echoes of a hammer on gopher wood. The roar of the rising waters, the flutter of a dove with an olive leaf, and the breathtaking arc of color in the storm. These are the enduring sounds and signs of a story that speaks of judgment, grace, and the unwavering promise of the God who holds the waters and paints the sky. The floodwaters raged, the ark groaned, and for a moment it seemed darkness had won. But the God who judges is the God who rescues. The same voice that commanded the waters to rise now paints the sky with a promise. Never again. So, when the storms come in your life, when the world feels broken or you feel alone, look up. See the bow in the clouds. Remember Noah. Remember the ark. And remember this, the God who shut the door still opens the way home. This story lives on because you pass it down. Like the video if you're part of the covenant. Subscribe for more hope-filled stories. Comment, God remembers, I have set my rainbow in the clouds. I will remember my covenant. Genesis 9 verses 13 and 15.